Hey everybody, and welcome back to our Wednesday at the Well class. Today we're going to cover two books, Ezra and Nehemiah. Let's pray together and then we'll get started. Father, today as we look into the words of Ezra and Nehemiah, I pray, God, that you will help us to appreciate how much went into compiling these and the other books of the Old Testament to give us a history of our faith. Father, help us today as we study that we will learn about these valuable lessons that your people, the Jews, learned, especially when it came to disobedience and unrighteousness before you. Father, help us to learn the lessons that they didn't, so that we can be a holy people in Christ's name. Amen. The books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther cover the very last 100 years of Old Testament history. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell us about the return of the remnant of the Israelites to Jerusalem from their captivity and the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. About 50 years after the fall of Jerusalem, the Jews came under the control of the Persians, which are the modern-day Iranians. The Persians conquered the Babylonians, who had been their masters, and so in doing so, they took over all the Babylonian subjects, including the Jews that the Babylonians had captured. In 538 BC, Cyrus issued a decree permitting and encouraging all the people that were in exile in the Persian kingdom to return to their homelands. This was a big radical shift in that before, kings that had conquered other people hauled all of the captives off to their homeland. But Cyrus took a different turn and sent and urged all of the people to go back to where they came from. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah give an account of the return to the land, to the city, to the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the walls. And then the book of Esther, which is the next book in the Old Testament, gives an account of someone who stayed in the land during captivity. So let's look first at the book of Ezra, and we'll go to the study guide right away to question number 1. It asks the question, Ezra had a dual ministry. What were his two roles according to chapter 7, verse 6, and and verse 11? So verse 6 says, this Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a teacher well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. The king had granted him everything he asked for the land of the Lord his God. For the hand of the Lord his God was on him. And then in chapter 7, verse 11, this is a copy of the letter King Xerxes had given to Ezra the priest, the teacher of the law, a man learned in matters concerning the commands and the decrees of the Lord for Israel. And so what were his two roles? Well, first of all, he was a teacher. He was well versed. He knew the word. And then also he was not only did he know the law, but he also knew the commands and the decrees of God. And so he was a man who had studied a lot. Ezra was a very intelligent man who God used in some really powerful ways. The word Ezra actually means help. He didn't lead the first group of Jews that went back to Jerusalem from exile. This was done by Zerubbabel and Joshua, another Joshua. Ezra came on the scene in chapter 7, where he had led a smaller second group of exiles that were returning to their homeland. And he remained there in Jerusalem to labor and later joined up with Nehemiah to complete the Lord's work as laid out in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 9. The book of Ezra deals solely with the return of the southern kingdom. The people of the northern kingdom, they never returned from their Assyrian captivity for a lot of reasons. There were no survivors of the royal dynasty because they'd all been killed. There were no spiritual leadership for them to preserve their spiritual heritage, their religion. They had lost their racial purity because of all the intermarriages, and thus the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were basically assimilated into the other populations of the ancient Middle East and essentially became a lost race. The fate of the southern kingdom, which is called Judah, was real different. They were able to preserve their worship. They were able to keep a certain degree of ethnic and religious purity. They also had a descendant of David that was taken into captivity with them, which meant that there was hope for the restoration of the Davidic throne whenever they were sent back. And in addition to that, the southern kingdom had scribes and priests who had not only preserved the law by writing things down, but also were able teachers of this law. The brief outline of the book goes this way: the restoration under Zerubbabel, and then the restoration under Ezra. So Ezra is a positive book. It has a positive message. It's the end of exile for the southern kingdom. It gives the people hope, and God is restoring them. So let's go to the first part, restoration under Zerubbabel. And we'll go to the next question, number 2. At the first of the book, what did the Lord move the heart of King Cyrus to do? Now, this is a very interesting little story in here, and so I'm going to read Ezra chapter 1, the first 4 verses. So let's begin at verse 1. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm, and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judea. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judea and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. Verse 4. And in any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. Now I want to back up a little bit and look at verse 3. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judea and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. That is a very interesting little phrase right there, the God who is in Jerusalem. Cyrus would have been typical of almost everybody back in those days, and that is that there were many gods, and that most of the gods were divided up based on locality. So Cyrus would have heard of Jehovah and would have thought of him as being the God of Israel, specifically, and the God who is in Jerusalem, limiting Jehovah God really to that region. Now we know that that's a misunderstanding of God, that God created the whole world, and that even though Cyrus obviously didn't know this, God had created him too. And so he had a different concept of God, probably like he saw himself being God-like and having reign over a particular area, basically modern day Iran. So just wanted to throw that in there because it really does tell us a lot about the thinking of people back in those days. Let's go to question number 3. But first, at Cyrus's first call, the first time he offered the people to go back to their home, only about 50,000 Jews took advantage of the opportunity to go back under the leadership of Zerubbabel, who was the grandson of King Jehoiachin, who was a descendant of David. He was the heir to the throne of Judah. And he's listed in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. So from this time on, the Israelites are now called the Jews because most of the remnant was from the tribe of Judah, so they called them Jews. Let's look at question number 3. There we are. What did Cyrus give to Sheshbazzar to take back to his homeland? All right, so not only was Cyrus turning them loose, but he was also, as we just read, providing the materials and means for them to go back and rebuild their city and their temple. And so this is an interesting little take out of chapter 1, starting in verse 5. Then the family heads of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. All their neighbors assisted them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with valuable gifts in addition to all of the freewill offerings. Verse 7. Moreover, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God. Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought by Mithredath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. This was the inventory. You see it, 30 gold dishes, silver dishes, pans, bowls, matching bowls, other articles. So lots and lots of silver and gold items here. A lot of wealth, worth a lot of money. So how many were there altogether? Well, altogether, there were 5,400 articles of gold and of silver. Sheshbazzar brought all these along with the exiles when they came up from Babylon to Jerusalem. When the southern kingdom had been taken captivity 70 years before, only the upper classes of people were deported en masse to Babylon. The remainder of the people that had been left in Judah were there to farm the land, so that because the Babylonians had conquered it, they didn't just want it to the land just to go back wild. They wanted to use it, so they left farmers there. And so when Cyrus decreed that these upper class Jews could go back to Jerusalem, only the very dedicated, faithful Jews were the ones that wanted to go. Many of the exiled Jews had built homes and established relations and businesses and all of that in Babylon. And so they didn't want to break those ties. They didn't want to face the hardship of going back, crossing the desert, rebuilding their city. And so they just stayed. And to this day, even in Iran, there is a large number of Jews that live in Iran, a large number to this very day. So although the leaders of the remnant were of the tribe of Judah, there were some Israelites from the rest of the other tribes, but they never had their tribal identity again, ever to this day. Let's look at question number 4. When the Jews reached Jerusalem after a journey of about 800 miles, what did they do? Now, this is Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, and I'm going to read it to you. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Josiah, the son of Zadok, and his fellow priest, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Verse 3, despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the festival of tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. Now look at verse 5. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred festivals of the Lord, as well as those brought as free will offerings to the Lord. This is a massive act of worship. As soon as they got back, the first thing they did is they started rebuilding their ability to worship God, and then they did it. Look at question number 5 in the same vein. When they started to rebuild the temple, the Esarhaddons, later known as the Samaritans, I'm glad they changed that name, offered to help. What was the reaction of the leaders of Judah to this proposition, and what did the Samaritans do to get even? All right, this is some interesting reading right here. And so we're going to read in chapters 4, the first 5 verses. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families, and they said, let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, you have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us. Now look at verse 4. Then the people around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and to make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrated their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, down to the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. Look at question number 6. The opposition of the Samaritans caused a 15-year delay in the work. Because of this, what 2 prophets did God raise up to encourage the people? And here, let's read this together. Now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. So with encouragement from the prophets, the temple is finished and dedicated within 4 years. It had taken a total of 20 years to rebuild the temple, but then finally the people in chapter 6 were able to celebrate the Passover. Now the Bible leaves about 60 silent years between the dedication of the temple and the arrival of Ezra. The only record of events during this time is the book of Esther. That's where the book of Esther falls in place. And that story takes place back in Persia. Now let's go to part 2, and let's look at the restoration under Ezra, chapter 7 through 10. So going to, excuse me again, question 7. What was the practice that the Israelites started again that had led to their downfall the first time? And what did Ezra do about it? All right, let's go to chapter 10. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You have been unfaithful. You have married foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt. Now honor the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the people around you and from your foreign wives." Verse 12, the whole assembly responded with a loud voice, "You are right. We must do as you say. But there are many people here, and it is the rainy season. So we cannot stand outside. Besides, this matter cannot be taken care of in a day or two, because we have sinned greatly in this thing." So you see that, so they acknowledge their sin, and yet they're unwilling to do what they are supposed to do in order to fix it. And so they just blow off what it is they're told to do in order to make this right. But when you get to chapter 10 and in verses 16 and 17, many of the exiles come around and decide that they'll do what they're asked to do. So Ezra, the priest, he selected some of the men who were family heads, one from each family division. And then on the first day of the 10th month, they sat down to investigate the cases. They began to dig into this, I guess almost like a special counsel, if you will, to start investigating all of these men that married into these foreign women. Now, I want to shift here, and there's much more to Ezra, but you will see it as you read it. This is only an introduction, so we're not trying to give all of it to you. But I want to introduce to you fairly quickly the book of Nehemiah. The temple had been rebuilt, worship had been reestablished, but the walls of Jerusalem were still in ruins. These walls had to be rebuilt if the city was to survive the next army that decided to attack them. So God raised up Nehemiah for the job of rebuilding the walls of the temple, or the walls of the city. And so that's how this book breaks out in an outline: rebuilding of the city walls and then a revival of the people. So we'll go to the rebuilding of the city walls. So Nehemiah had risen to this trusted position as a cupbearer for Artaxerxes, who was the king of Persia. His job was to taste the king's wine to see if it had been poisoned. It wasn't a great job. But when Nehemiah heard of the sad shape of the people of Jerusalem, he became very distraught. So here he is in the king's presence, Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. He works with him. He sees him every day. And he's sad. He's brokenhearted. So let's go to question 8 and see where this heads. So for 4 months, Nehemiah prayed and grieved over the condition of the Jews in Jerusalem. When the king detected his sadness, see, there's what I was talking about. What did he do? All right, so this is Artaxerxes. And here's what it says. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This could be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very afraid, he said, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it that you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I asked the king, verse 5, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, and so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I reach Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. Nehemiah went to Jerusalem with the authority of the king of Persia to rebuild the city walls. Therefore, acting as the governor of the city, he organized the reconstruction by assigning a portion of the walls to each family. Each of these groups had a supervisor, and so under Nehemiah's leadership, the wall that had remained in ruins for about 100 years after the return of Zerubbabel, chapter 6, verse 15 tells us, it was rebuilt in 52 days. All right, let's go to part 3, which is our last, part 2, which is our last part, and that is the reviving of the people. So after the completion of the walls, Ezra returns to Jerusalem to assist Nehemiah in dedicating the walls and sanctifying the people. So Ezra stood on a pulpit of wood, and he read the law to the people. Now look at question number 9. Once again, the book of law to the people, once again, the book of law to the people was found, and it sparked another revival. What feast was reinstated? So reading in chapter 8, verses 13 through 17. On the second day of the month, the heads of all the families, along with the priests and the Levites, gathered around Ezra, the teacher, to give attention to the words of the law. They found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded through Moses, that the Israelites were to live in temporary shelters during the festival of the 7th month, and that they should proclaim this word and spread it throughout their towns and in Jerusalem. Go out into the hill country and bring back branches from olive and wild olive trees, and from myrtles, palms, and shade trees to make temporary shelters, as it is written. So the people went out and brought back branches and built themselves temporary shelters on their own roofs, in their own courtyards, in the courts of the house of God, and in the square by the water gate, and the one by the gate of Ephraim. The whole company that had returned from exile built temporary shelters and lived in them. From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated it like this, and their joy was very great. So the achievements and the faith of Ezra and of Nehemiah can hardly be overemphasized. Without Ezra's teaching, without Nehemiah's leadership, the Jewish religion and their community may not have survived. But God used them to do this. At the close of the book of Nehemiah, the Jews are on their own land, but they're still ruled by the Persians. No further record of the Jews is found in the Bible until we get to the birth of Jesus, the Christ, in the New Testament. Your homework for this week is to read the book of Esther. It's an interesting story. We're going to walk through it next week. But it's an important story, almost like a sidebar story to what was going on during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Some really seriously good insight into the mind of the people that day. So thank you for being here today. I hope you learned something, and I hope you'll come back next week where we're going to jump right into Esther. So thanks a lot.